Former Fox News host Tucker Carlson interviewed Russian President Vladimir Putin. Thus far, the interview has over 193 million views on X alone, formerly Twitter, plus tens of millions of views on his shorter clips that are circulating online. During the 2-hour chat, they discussed the war in Ukraine, NATO expansion, and the imprisonment of an American journalist. Joining me now to discuss is research analyst at the Centre for Naval Analysis, Julian Waller. Julian, thank you so much for your time. What was your main takeaway from the interview?
Thank you, Rita. Very happy to be here. What I would say, this interview is unique. It's unusual in many respects. And most of all, it provided very, very good introduction to Vladimir Putin's unique historical obsessions. He spent over half an hour talking about ancient to medieval to modern history as part of a broader claim, a territorial claim, a claim of sovereignty on and over Ukraine itself. This is not a new point for Vladimir Putin the last several years. If you are Russian, if you live in Russia, you hear this from him fairly often. He will go on these historical tangents. But what is new is that we're hearing this in the sort of Anglo-American sphere for the first time with such a wide and broad audience. And it also adds some nuances to how we think about the causes of the war itself. That there's very much so a personal component to it that Mr. Putin obsesses over.
Well, it's apparent that the history of the region is just critically important to Putin. You mentioned he spoke about it for half an hour and he would not be deviated from it. He was going to give that history lesson. Is this just a justification for his invasion of Ukraine, or is it the real motivating factor behind the invasion?
So this is a major question that we have among international relations scholars, policymakers, and just people generally observing the conflict. What causes the war? What's the ultimate motivation vis-a-vis various casus belli, right? So there's a lot of different arguments for why the war started, and there's several arguments that the Russian state, the Russian government, have put forward, right? We've heard about NATO expansion. We've heard about protecting Russian speakers in southeastern Ukraine. We've heard about denazification, so-called. We've heard about all of these varying reasons and justifications or legitimating strategies for the war, why the war was going on. When the war began, Vladimir Putin, in his announcements to various Russian institutions, he specified sort of protection of the two so-called people's republics, the separatist regions in Ukraine at the time. However, what's important here is we have sort of surface level justifications, which certainly may have important degrees of rhetorical truth from the Russian perspective. And then there's sort of the actual hard causal argument, right? What really motivated Russia and the autocrat of Russia, Vladimir Putin, to decide in February of 2022? And that's a major question. That's not the same thing as just saying, here are a variety of reasons, because many of these reasons have existed for a long time. NATO expansion has been a perennial point of contention between Russia and the West, right? Putin himself, in his remarks to Tucker, talks about this at length, right? It's not like NATO expansion doesn't matter in the broader rhetorical strategy or in perhaps some degree of threat perception. But if that's the case, why in 2022 as opposed to 2019 or 2015 or 2014 or 2008, so on and so forth, right? So we need to, given that that variable doesn't really change, we have to understand a little bit more. And what this particular performance by the Russian president suggests is that there is a personal motivation, a deep interest in history that's been jump-started in recent years. This is another data point to suggest that this obsession is personal and deep. We also have the very, very important essay that Vladimir Putin himself wrote just about a half a year before the invasion itself, in summer of 2021, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which goes through many of the same points. We know through Russian channels that during the COVID pandemic, he's an older man. He had a germophobic tendency. He isolated himself during this time. Not only did he isolate himself with close friends, that had fairly extreme or more hardcore views on Ukraine. But he also took time in isolation to order evidence from archives, from the Russian state archives, for him to pore over, which helped him indeed write, or at least partially write, a history essay, which he then published in a Russian newspaper for the entire country to see. At the time, we thought it was kind of silly, a little bit of an eccentricity. It turns out that essay might, in fact, be one of the more important documents in terms of understanding the actual motivations and triggers of a major world leader who will, in due course, precipitate a major territorial war.
Now, you mentioned NATO expansion. If we had a second Trump term, given his attitude to NATO, how do you think that conflict is going to play out? What would a Trump presidency do to the Russian-Ukraine conflict?
The question is a little bit difficult because the first Trump term compared to a hypothetical second Trump term is potentially quite distinct. Trump has always talked in a very sort of materialistic and quid pro quo way about NATO. He doesn't particularly like it, at least in our estimation. He is constantly talking about the need for other European and other allied states to pay up, even though that's not quite how the NATO structure works. But nevertheless, one can view that as a form of pressure. And to some degree, it did work from 2017 to 2020. We don't want to read too much into that in terms of intentionality. But European powers did begin to see that they couldn't solely rely on the US during that time. The other point that we have to keep in mind is what didn't happen. The United States did not withdraw from NATO. The United States did not renege on its Article 5 guarantee, which is the cornerstone of the alliance. So that's the first Trump term. A new Trump term might be a little bit different, right? This is now several years later. Mr. Trump has gotten even more vociferous and vehement about his distaste for NATO. In many ways, his rhetoric is more radical than it was in the past. So it's unclear if the fact that the ultimate outcome did not match his rhetoric in his first term, whether that will remain the case in a second term. It's very, very difficult to predict that.